and CAC depend on us to fill their pantries at this critical time of year. Lashana Tova Tikatevu, may you be inscribed in the book of life.
Roger, thank you. And thank you for all that you've been doing to make sure that we can continue to serve this community. Shana Tova, everyone. This is one of those years when pretty much every rabbi is supposed to be talking about the same thing. Now, had there not been a pandemic, I was all ready to talk about the fact is that today is, and I'm not making this up, National Talk Like a Pirate Day. But I resisted the urge. I mean, no one wants to hear a sermon with all kinds of references to dread pirates and swashbuckling. And for that matter, I'm sure there are still some rabbis out there who are dead set about talking about the biography of some obscure sage or some abstract point of Jewish law that only comes up every few years. But no, this year you could never get away with that. You have to talk about the state of the world. And it's hard to know where to begin. After all, we start with the impact of the pandemic on our personal lives, and you add the political crises, the social upheaval, financial challenges, wildfires, hurricanes, a changing landscape for Israel, unprecedented pressures on our own Jewish community, anti-Semitism. Can any of us remember another time like this? Well, few of us remember firsthand the upheavals of World War II, the Holocaust, or the Great Depression. And some of you may point to the 1960s, but frankly, if you remember the 1960s, you probably weren't actually there. What's more remarkable, as crazy as this time is that this time is actually a time of transition. On the one hand, life today is totally different than it was last high holidays. If the pace of your day, your human interactions, your celebrations is the same as it was 9 months ago, then there is something seriously wrong with you. But this time is not in any way the end. This is the middle. We will not be in the same place, High Holidays 5782, as we are in High Holidays 5781. But we will also not be back where we were in High Holidays 5780. Later today, we will sing Hayom Harat Olam. A new world is in utero. A new world is going to be born. And we are experiencing those first contractions, those first labor pains. The tears, the anguish, the anxiety at some point will pass and we'll be in a new place. What does it mean to be expecting the birth of a new world? These months of coronavirus have been for many of us a retreat into the womb of home, of shelter, of isolation. But the months of expectation are also of a foreshadowing of the birth of a new world for the world as a whole, for our Jewish community, for each of us as individuals. As I grapple with what it means to be present at the birth of a new world, I want to reflect back on the life and the times of a sage who saw the gestation and birth of a new world and actually helped with its delivery. And for very specific and personal reasons, as I reach the end of his biography, maybe you'll understand why it resonates so much for me this year. And his life experience will give us insight into the new world that is waiting to be born, not just the world as a whole, but our Jewish and personal worlds as well. His name was Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai. He was a student of the great and patient sage Hillel. And in fact, he was one of the very first sages to be called rabbi. He lived through the most horrific and traumatic era in Jewish history, the destruction of Jerusalem by the Romans in the year 70. And he played a greater role than anyone else in the renewal of our traditions and the creation of Judaism as we know it. An important point. There are many different accounts of the destruction of Jerusalem and the burning of our holy temple 1950 years ago. What they all agree is that that destruction did not need to happen. The Romans weren't interested in destruction for the sake of destruction. They just wanted to collect their taxes. The Jews refused to submit, and the crazed emperor, Nero, sent a great general, Vespasian, to subdue them. It was at that point that the Jews made two of the classic blunders: never get involved in a land war in Asia, and never go up against Vespasian when death is on the line. And they might have gotten away with their mistake. Jerusalem was well fortified, well armed, and well supplied. There were 3 wealthy men who had had so much grain and wine and salt and oil and wood that they could have held out, the Talmud says, for 21 years. So much grain and salt and wood that they could have won every game of Settlers of Catan ever. And yet, by the way, Vespasian was willing to accept de-escalation on favorable terms. But there was a Jewish faction, the Zealots, who wanted conflict. The brute squad would rather lose than compromise, and they burned all the supplies, forcing suffering, famine, war, and ultimately defeat. When I first read this story, it seemed to me shocking, I dare say inconceivable, that the leaders of the Jewish people would inflict such suffering on their own, out of ignorance or perhaps even out of malice, in order to better their own position. But we live in a world where that is increasingly the case. We can all point to our favorite examples of leaders, of parties, of movements who would rather just let it burn or even light the fire themselves to the suffering of others and even the death and destruction of their own followers. On the other hand, you can also look at positive news of this past week. The United Arab Emirates and Bahrain signed a peace treaty with Israel, the Abraham Accords, and I am grateful to the U.S. government for helping foster that deal. And by the way, this is an example of someone being willing to compromise. Israel was willing to give up some things, the right to annex land in the West Bank, that is in some ways, by the way, the heartland of our biblical faith. And it allowed the United Arab Emirates to get advanced jet fighters, but Israel gained a lot more. We've had peace before with Jordan, with Egypt, and what they had to offer was a cold peace. So Israel wouldn't have to guard the border quite as hard. But this is a different story. There is truly a new world being born in a new Middle East. There are opportunities for scientific and economic collaboration, tourism. Even though at the moment travel is limited, I am thinking ahead to our next Israel trip. Maybe not this summer, but maybe next winter. And when we go, you can actually continue. You could fly direct from Tel Aviv to Dubai. And I've heard that Emirates Airlines makes El Al look like El Al. Imagine Dubai with more kosher restaurants than Atlanta. Inconceivable. Tens of thousands of Israelis interacting person to person with business associates, with friends in the Sultanates. I read that they are already starting to film Israeli reality TV shows in Dubai. And it will go the other way as well. Thousands of Muslim tourists coming to Jerusalem is great news. It means that any player in the Middle East who tries to foment terror, who tries to disrupt these connections, will be ostracized, which is, by the way, the real motivation for this deal. Iran, the need to join a common defense against those who are looking to burn it down. Iran and the network of failed states that are its allies. It would have been nice, and it will be nice, when we can have real peace with the Palestinians as well. And they responded with condemnations from the West Bank and rocket attacks from Gaza. Like the Zealots, of Rabbi Yochanan's day, they would rather burn down their own city, destroying their chances over and over again, than move forward into a new world. And the reason why this deal went through is because their neighbors, their allies said, "We go weary of your rejectionism. It's time to move forward and let a new world be born." But back to our story about a rabbi who anticipated and helped birth a new world. In this crisis of siege and zealotry, Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai was the leader of the rabbis who were a small and insignificant faction. But his nephew, Abba Sikara, was the leader of the zealots. And ben Zakkai pleaded with his nephew, to call off the attack. But the leader refused. Yochanan ben Zakkai was visibly ill at the news. And the next thing you know, there he was in a coffin, and his students were ready to bear him to burial outside the walls. The zealots were suspicious. They wanted to pierce him, poke him, go through his pockets and look for loose change. But the leader of the zealots, showing respect for his aged uncle, would not allow it. And so ben Zakkai's students brought his coffin to the edge of the Roman encampment, and it turned out that he was more than slightly alive. He had faked his own death to escape. And by the way, who among us has not considered that option after several weeks of remote schooling or 2.5 hours of a Zoom meeting? Ben Zakkai came before the general Vespasian, wanting to plead for the safety of Jerusalem. He addressed him, "Hail, King, Ave." Vespasian took a liking to the rabbi. "But you know, by calling me king, you have committed treason against the emperor, and you are worthy of death. But you seem a decent fellow. I hate to kill you." Ben Zakkai explained that his words were justified. "I know something you don't know. Soon the emperor will die, and you, Vespasian, will be called to take his place." And sure enough, just moments later, a messenger came with that very news. Knowing that Ben Zakkai would plead for Jerusalem to be spared, Vespasian told him that even with his new authority, he could not comply. He would send his evil substitute, the next general, Titus, to complete the mission, have fun storming the temple. Ben Zakkai could have given up. He could have wallowed in a pit of despair. For 1,000 years, the center of Jewish worship had been the temple in Jerusalem. It was the only place where you could bring your offerings, atone for your sins, celebrate holidays. Without a temple, our Jerusalem was, it would seem, dead. Indeed, when the temple was destroyed, Ben Zakkai was devastated. We are told he tore his clothes. He sat by the side of the road weeping. And that could have been it for us. With the emperor as our enemy and the sages put to the sword, our people would have been friendless, brainless, helpless, hopeless. We would have vanished like so many other nations conquered by the Roman legions, forgotten like the Carthaginians, the Etruscans, the Idumeans, the Parthians. But all was not lost. Vespasian said, "Ask me for something that I can give you. I can't give you Jerusalem, but make me another offer." And fortunately, even when confronted with overwhelming destruction, Ben Zakkai was ready to see the possibility that a new world might be born. He realized that Jerusalem was only mostly dead. He asked that the city of Yavne be saved, along with some of the most important sages. And Vespasian responded, "As you wish." Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai's forethought created Judaism as we know it, establishing a new center of Jewish learning and culture, a new approach to Jewish life and observance. Yochanan ben Zakkai realized that the world was changing, that Judaism had to change with it. There had to be a substitute for the sacrifices of the temple. Just like we'll read tomorrow that the ram was substituted for Isaac, animal substitute for human. Ben Zakkai took the next step and said that holiness could be found in things other than the temple sacrifices. He told his student, Rabbi Joshua, "No, my son, don't you know we have another means of making atonement, deeds of love, as Hosea says, I desire kindness and not sacrifice." And the text goes on to say that he identified daily prayer as another substitute. And he, Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai, and his followers melded together the earliest elements of Jewish prayer to create the liturgy as we know it. Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai understood that there was a new world being born. But ben Zakkai went further. Let me explain. As you have probably already noticed, we did not sound the shofar today, even though it's Rosh Hashanah, and we won't until tomorrow. And it's kind of shocking because, after all, the shofar is the most essential ritual of the day. It moves us to repent. It moves God to forgive. It's the wordless prayer that inspires our hearts. And indeed, the very name in the Bible is Yom Teruah, the day of sounding of the shofar. And yet, we don't sound the shofar on Shabbat. It's not because it's work. After all, you're not supposed to do work on Rosh Hashanah either. The practice was that you should only blow shofar on Shabbat if you are in the temple, for there it was part of the special ritual. And then, one year in Yavne, Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai announced, we should blow the shofar here. Even though they weren't in the temple, because of course there wasn't a temple. But he knew it was what the people needed to hear that year. His colleagues protested, we should discuss this. He responded, let's sound the shofar and then we'll discuss. This is a classic debating tactic, because after the shofar was sounded, his colleagues said, okay, Nu, let's discuss. And ben Zakkai responded, hey, we already blew the shofar. Now there's nothing to talk about. Now, ben Zakkai's practice didn't stick. You have to fast forward to the Reform movement in the last century or two to find people blowing shofar on Shabbat again. And in part, that's because we observe a second day, so as long as you come back tomorrow, you haven't missed anything. But he knew that at that time, that was what was needed. A rule that had stood for centuries, perhaps since the Bible, was set aside at least temporarily in a moment of crisis. So maybe you've guessed why this year I feel like Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai is looking over my shoulder. Because in some ways we are having the same experience today. This is, if I dare say, a Rosh Hashanah of unusual size. Those congregations that are open for live worship are having them in far smaller numbers, with distancings, with tents, with shifts. And then there are those of us who are primarily online. And that's actually kind of my fault. For the past 12 years, I've been one of the members of the Committee on Jewish Law and Standards, and we offer guidance to the conservative movement on how to approach issues of Jewish law. And stereotypically, my role on the committee has been to provide comic relief and vote no. And yet, for a while now, I've been thinking about this question of streaming. Maybe 10% of conservative synagogues were doing it. This year, it's 90%. When I raised the question in November, we imagined that online services would be one way, restricted to those who were sick, or maybe those who were a little lazy. Basically, the few people who couldn't come to synagogue would watch passively as the real Jews prayed on screen. The response to that was at best lukewarm. Encouraging Jews to turn on their phones and computers to log into a website on Shabbat? Inconceivable. And then, of course, the pandemic hit and things moved quickly. In 1 week, the committee put out guidance that in order to constitute a minyan, you had to have 10 Jews all in the same place, and everyone else could watch remotely. A week later, every synagogue in the country was heading to lockdown, and I was able to convince a minority to backtrack and to admit to the possibility, based on an obscure precedent from a previous academic, that you could actually constitute a minyan over Zoom if 10 Jews could see each other, even if you were not in the same place. I spent the next months of the pandemic, while everyone else was out buying yeast and toilet paper, creating a 34-page opinion paper, a tshuva, which laid out in detail all of the potential issues of using Zoom or Stream on Shabbat, all the potential violations of the fourth commandment and their ramifications, and how each one could be addressed. How someone could remain totally observant and leave their computer on and be just not an observer, but actually a participant in an online service. I'm confident that this paper was the first written work in history that mentioned the Talmud, vuvuzelas, Peloton, and included an appendix on how to edit your Windows registry. It passed the committee, which is good, because here at B'nai Torah, we had already been following it for 2 months. The shofar had already been blown in Yavne. There were a few snags. Some of my conservative colleagues were opposed. What hideous sin have you permitted lately? When I talked about making a Zoom kosher, they responded, kosher? I do not think it means what you think it means. And there were other roadblocks to creating, if you will, a kosher Zoom. To take one example, Zoom normally closes a room after 24 hours. Everyone is logged out. The second day of the holiday can't happen. And I have to admit, I felt like Rabbi Yochanan pleading with Vespasian, going up the ladder of tech support at Zoom, until finally, with the help of a colleague, I was able to reach the head of marketing for North America, a nice Jewish boy. And they agreed to make changes to their settings to make Zoom kosher. By the way, it's not the first time an Atlanta rabbi has convinced a multinational corporation to change its secret formula. Rabbi Tobias Geffen, the rabbi at Shereth Israel, was the first outsider to learn the secret formula for Coca-Cola. And it turned out that there was just a hint of non-kosher fat in there. But he was able to convince them to take it out and change the secret formula. So, the time that I could have spent making this sermon shorter was spent enabling 300 synagogues to take advantage. And thousands of Jews across the country are having the same experience that you are. So Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai was remembered for a lot of things. I've only told you a few of his stories and teachings. I lay awake at night wondering if 300 years from now, I will be remembered as the rabbi who told everyone to use their computers on Shabbat. So here we are on Zoom, on Rosh Hashanah. But this is still actually not the end. This is still the pregnancy, the gestational moment. There is a new world that is still waiting to be born. And that world excites and terrifies me. Because there is, if you will, an elephant in the Zoom. What happens next? So next year, how many of you will be here in this room with me? How many will still be at home? Right now, it's easy to figure out because we're all at distance. But when we start coming back together, how do you create a sense of equality when some are in the pews and some are on the screen? When do you say it's time to turn off the Zoom? And there are ways that this could go horribly wrong. Are we heading towards having a Jumbotron over the Ark? I cringe at the thought of having the Saturday morning red zone. Just watching the highlights from synagogues across the country. Lou Schwartz gets 7 columns on a Hagbah. Bar Mitzvah Boy has not gotten a single note of the Haftorah yet correct and is heading for the no-hitter. Shirley Finkel is going to try to beat the previous record for lox on a plate. I also worry about the impact that this will have on Shabbat as a different day, as a day of rest. For most of my life, Shabbat was a refuge from technology. And now it's a seventh day of the week, staring not just sometimes at one screen, but at two. I used to ask people to turn off their phones in shul. Now will I be asking people to turn on their shul on their phones? And yet we recognize that the world will not go back to the way it was, because there are those for whom this will continue to be a godsend. Even when the rest of us back are to hugging and kissing and rushing to get the tuna fish, there are people who are immunocompromised, who are frail, who are isolated, who for the first time can feel like they are connected to community and are afraid to lose that. As we go through these holidays, I hope you'll reflect, what parts of this experience would you want to have again? What parts will you want to hold on to? And what will you want to go back to the old normal? But I will tell you what this also means is that what it means to be a community is changing. What does it mean? You know, my mom used to come in a few times a year to visit, and now she is on services every week. Hi, Mom. We have people who have joined our congregation from Florida, from Massachusetts. And by the way, it is not just here that people are creating community online. One of the biggest winners of the pandemic is a company called Peloton, a multi-billion-dollar corporation. They have found a way for people to have the experience of communal exercise without leaving their homes. My wife, Wendy, has joined the cult of Peloton. I myself am in a Pelo clergy group. Now I'm in it, but I don't even exercise. But what does it mean when you can connect to Judaism coming from anywhere and everywhere? Do people retain connections with their local congregations? A few months ago, I checked my email after Shabbat, and I had gotten a bunch of messages from congregants. We're so proud of you. I'm like, I thought my sermon was fine. I read forward. You know, we were watching the services at Park Avenue Synagogue, and Rabbi Zuckerman mentioned you in the sermon. Will this begin the age of Jewish televangelism, where a few mega synagogues with star rabbis and big production budgets shove everyone else out of the way? It's possible. And if so, I have got to stop cutting my own hair. But more than that, if you can participate for free, what does it even mean to be a member of a synagogue? If you have never met the people you're praying with in person, what does that connection mean? How strong is a connection if you just turn on the TV? Will your Yom Kippur just be more Mrs. Maisels or Tiger King? I do think there's hope. I would bet you that there are more American Jews participating in some kind of synagogue activity today than there have been in many years. And what the music industry has learned is that if you enjoy something by streaming it for free, eventually you will want to go see it live. There's a new generation that has never known a world without an iPhone and Instagram and thinks Facebook is for old people like me. Their social lives are a merger of the digital and the real. Because synagogues are not an end to themselves, they are a tool. They are a means to connect Jews to each other and to God. And if nothing else, we may be saved by Kiddush. Until someone figures out how to send cookies over Wi-Fi, people will still want to be together. The people who ride Peloton in their basements will still want to see everyone in person to talk about their rides. But of course, it's not just our synagogue, our Jewish world. There is a new world waiting to be born today, as we sing Hayom Harat Olam. Today is a world expectant with possibilities, because it's not just Jewish life that is changing. You know, Offices and business trips will not go back to the way that they were. Movie theaters. People will think differently about where they live and work. People will think differently about how they get their groceries. If you can do school over Zoom, is that at the end of the snow day? If you think that the world is going back to the way it was, get used to disappointment. Maybe it will remain socially acceptable to have the Donald Duck wardrobe and only get dressed from the waist up. I have some advice. One of my hopes and my prayers for 5781, especially for those of you without your video on right now. Pants. Pants. They're terribly comfortable. I think everyone will be wearing them in the future. How will your world change? As a parent, as a grandparent, as a teacher, as a worker, as a manager? Will we be shaking hands again? Will we be hugging and kissing again? Will you go on a cruise? Are you able to look ahead and see the new world that is being born? Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai saw a new world being born, but he realized that it did not take a crisis, a pandemic. He had 5 students who carried on after him and transmitted Judaism as we know it. He asked each of them what was the best path, and one of them, Rabbi Shimon, said, the wisest path was haro'eh et hanolad. The wisest path was one who can anticipate what would be born. He taught his students well. So, you see, it doesn't have to take a pandemic for a new world to be born, for a new you to be born. These high holidays are about realizing that every time in our lives is transitional. Not just the moments of crisis, but that any time we could encounter the shift, the opportunity, the crisis, the tremor that forces us to think differently about who we are, that forces us to reflect on our most closely held values. These high holidays celebrate the birthday of the world. They force us to consider, how will the world be reborn? And us along with it. These high holidays are a gut check for our congregation as an institution, for me as a rabbi, for me as a person, as we change literally everything we do. I hope that these high holidays are an eye-opening moment for you too. We can never really truly anticipate our life path. 5 years ago, there were people, in 2015, there were people being asked in job interviews, so, where do you see yourself in 5 years? Everyone got that answer wrong. And yet, we must look ahead. We have to learn the lesson of Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai watching his beloved city being destroyed from within. We don't have to succumb to baseless animosity and self-destruction like the zealots. We can learn the lesson of Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai. We can't be paralyzed by grief over what we have lost. We have to respond to the moments of greatest crisis with our greatest creativity and flexibility. We can anticipate those moments where old paradigms are broken and there is an opportunity for change in our lives. So let me close with this charge to each of us. Each of us on our chairs, on our sofas, on our porches. I ask you to think about what changes are coming for you. How can you renew your relationships? How can you refresh your skills? How can you reapply your values in the new world that is being born? In the world, in our synagogue, in our lives, at this very moment, there is a new world being born. And I pray that everyone listening and watching is able to be a part of it. And I beg you, we don't want that birth to be premature. Even If you are one of those people who think that people in masks can't be trusted, be careful. Because people are really dying out there. I know because I've buried them. And I've talked to the younger people who don't recover so quickly. Be careful out there, because if you haven't got your health, then you haven't got anything. And be careful because there is a lot to look forward to. There is a new world being born, a new larger world, a new Jewish world, a new world within you. Missing out on the birth of a new world being born would be, well, inconceivable. Shana Tova, everyone. We turn back to our prayer books. We continue Chamol on page 146.
חמול על מעשיך ותשמח במעשיך ויאמרו לך חוסיך בצדקך עמוסיך תוקדש אדון על כל מעשיך.
The ark is open